Okay, um, I think we'll get going, and I imagine people will start to trickle in as we go. But we might as well start because we have a lot of things to cover over the next hour. So I just wanted to introduce myself and say hello. I'm John Anderson, and I'm Technology Director at Smart Design, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual Smart Salon on how social design can make new products more human. This evening, we welcome author Carla Diana for a conversation with technology journalist Stacey Higginbotham about Carla's new book, My Robot Gets Me: How Social Design Can Make New Products More Human, published by the Harvard Business Review Press. Before I hand it over to Carla and Stacey, I want to say a few words about some of the cool things we build at Smart. As an innovation design consultancy, we celebrate inclusive design that's about designing for people and not things, which is an important mantra as our problems and technology become more complex. Oftentimes, when designing a new product or service using emerging technology, we have to ask ourselves why, whether that's developing a personalized hydration ecosystem with Gatorade or partnering with Fast Company to research bicycle lane safety using big data. We use technology as a tool to bring design to life and not the other way around. As technology becomes part of our everyday work lives, we have realized it can help Smart improve our entire design process. As an example, we use machine learning as a tool to build personalized IoT products, and alternatively, have used it in quantitative research to unveil possible pain points and opportunity areas within a new category. We tried not to use technology for technology's sake and never oversimplify how ML or AI will work as some sort of like magical force that will get us from point A to point B. Which brings me to our two guests today. We often call technology-enabled devices smart, but what actually makes them smart? Should that even be a term we use to describe these products? Well, I'm happy to introduce Stacey and Carla to discuss her new book, My Robot Gets Me, to perhaps answer some of these questions. Now, if you haven't gotten a copy of My Robot Gets Me, we have a special 40% offer code courtesy of the Harvard Business Review Press that we're going to post in the chat along with the code that's available at checkout. And so I will hand it over.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, John. My name is Stacey Higginbotham. I am, as I mentioned, a technology journalist. I do a podcast called the Internet of Things podcast and a website and newsletter called Stacey on IoT. And it has been my privilege to have Carla come on the show twice at least. And I talk to her on a regular basis because she is very smart. And not only is she smart, she's savvy about the way that people actually want to live in their houses with these devices. So I am very excited to have her talk about her new book and to explain to us why we should be thinking not just about smart devices, but social devices. So, Carla, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. It's a very exciting day. The launch of my new book, My Robot Gets Me. And before we get into the discussion, I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. I am a product designer, originally trained as a mechanical engineer. My focus has always been on this way that the physical and the digital intersect one another. And with that, I've worked as a product designer many years at Smart Design, so it's great to see some old friends. And from there, I developed my own practice, and nowadays I work as head of design for a company called Diligent Robotics that I'll talk a little bit about. And I co-host a podcast with a fellow named Dr. Tom Goriello. It's called the Robopsych podcast. So we talk about a lot of issues in technology and society. And I also lead the 4D design program at Cranbrook Academy of Art, where I lead discussions and guide students in projects around just this very thing. So I don't want to go on too much, but what I'm going to do is share my screen so that I can talk a little bit about some of the principles of the book before we launch into our discussion. So I'm going to do that. And So the idea behind the book was really that I had been working in this field, teaching. I started a series of courses at University of Pennsylvania, SVA, and launched one at Parsons that were around designing smart objects, and was working with some wonderful colleagues, including a woman named Dr. Wendy Jew, who is at Cornell Tech, and realized that there was just a lot more to be said than simply technology. And a lot of the insight for the book comes from a history of more than a decade of working in the field of social robotics. So when I was a visiting assistant professor at Georgia Tech, I met a wonderful professor named Andrea Tamaz, who was looking for a designer with whom to collaborate. And we started working together, and I got introduced to this entire field that is called social robotics. It was launched at MIT Media Lab with Cynthia Brazil. And the focus of this field is really to study how we might interact with our computing machines in a way that feels natural and intuitive. So instead of having to type a bunch of code in a keyboard or even a series of button presses, could we interact with computing devices by simply bringing to the table what we know about being a human being? And that's it. So the illustration that you see on the left of the screen is Simon, and that was the first project that I did collaboratively with the Socially Intelligent Machines Lab, led by Andrea Tamaz. And what we were doing there was, it was a machine that had a camera and microphones and pads in its hands, and we were building it to be a learning device. So you could hand it an object, you could teach it about a color or some way to manipulate that object, and not only would it understand you as a person, but it would respond back to you the way, with cues that we understand as people. So the ears have these very expressive gestures. The eyes actually blink. The hands can, if the robot doesn't understand, it can say, I don't know. And from there, I worked with her and her amazing team, and I should say it is an army of artificial intelligence, mechanical engineering, and other technical and research specialists. And from there was developed this robot for a company called Diligent Robotics that Andrea is leading. And that's the robot you see on the right. Diligent is completely focused on the healthcare setting because nurses are burnt out, they're exhausted, they are, hospitals are understaffed, and the upshot is that patients don't get the best care. And the company did research to realize that nurses were doing things like hanging out in closets to assemble kits and essentially doing factory work. So the company developed this robot, and I had the pleasure of leading the design. And it is just like I described. You speak to the robot, you can gesture to the robot can see people in its midst. It can navigate this really difficult hospital environment that is hectic, that is confusing, that is difficult just by itself, but to have to operate a machine in the midst of it becomes even more difficult. So that is the premise behind the social robotics. For me as a designer, I extrapolated that and have been using that with everyday objects. So something like a vacuum cleaner can also benefit from the principles of social robotics. And in the book, I talk about a few key principles. So one thing that we know as designers, and the traditional way that we've designed interactive products, is to have messages that are kind of baked in. And so we might have a microwave, and when it's done, it beeps to let us know it's done, and there's just a message that shows up on a screen. With new technology, what we have the ability to do is actually interact with our products as entities. So instead of having a pre-baked message, we are actually having a conversation that is evolving as we use the product. There's a core framework that I talk about in the book that is kind of like an onion with a series of ideas that build on one another. And it starts with the idea of presence and how important the physicality of the object is. We talk so much about how our interactive devices are disappearing into walls and becoming miniaturized, but actually as people, we need to have some relationship between our bodies and faces and hands and the device. So this is the Nest camera. There's a great interview in the book with the lead designer who talks about some of the nuances of how to make an outdoor camera not feel like a scary overlord. Expression is the next ring. So once you have your physical presence, how does it actually communicate with you? And I talk about 3 modalities: light, sound, and movement. So this is a product from Wonder Workshop that is a kid's toy that can be programmed. And it's got this amazing circle of lights. And you can get a wide range of emotion between color, between the intensity of the light, and also the animation of, it's a series of segmented lights. The next ring is interaction. So this is something from Wendy Ju that is a project that I love that she did with a team at the Stanford Center for Design Research. And it is called a mechanical ottoman. And it is an ottoman that will actually, it is a Wizard of Oz prototype for an ottoman that will approach you, lift its little lid a little bit and communicate with you, taking cues from the person in order to understand how it should respond. Context is incredibly important and one of the trickiest things for our robotic and computing devices to understand. And by context, it's not just the who, what, and when, but actually the state of mind of the person who's using it. So the example I have in the book is called the Hammerhead. It's a bicycle navigator. Some friends of mine at Tomorrow Lab were part of the design process. And it not only has the physical presence that's appropriate for biking, it's rugged, it's waterproof, it just has a series of lights rather than having you dig into the nuances of a map and a screen, but it is totally contextually appropriate. And then the final ring is ecosystems. So thinking about how families of devices work together. How does your scale communicate with your fitness device, communicate with charts and keeping a trend of your behavior? And ultimately, I talk about intelligence as not being about what we think of about that we see in science fiction around an all-knowing intelligence, but a social savvy. So this example is the New York Times Labs listening table that was led by a designer named Noah Feehan and a great team over there. And it will only listen when it's given permission to listen. It actually will take dictation. It lets people know which person it's listening to. It will then transcribe that information. People can put markers in it. Read the book. This is a super cool project. With that, I think I don't want to go on for much longer because we're going to have a really exciting conversation, and I want to give Stacey a chance to get us started. So I am going to stop sharing and we can get into it.
Okay. Thank you, Carla. And don't worry, you're going to hear so much more from Carla. I'm just going to ask her a bunch of questions and she'll go into a lot of this. So, but you should read the book. That is important. All right. So I was thinking about this as I was reading the book. I have if I think about it, maybe 4 or 5 robots in my home. I have like an Amazon Echo that I think of as a robot. I have a Roomba. I have all of these things. And so just to set the stage so we understand why we're even talking about this, what is the worst case scenario if we don't design socially savvy robots? What are we afraid of if this world comes to pass where we're not thinking this way?
Yeah, well, the worst case scenario is, I think, a little bit of what we're already seeing, right? And I get so many questions about our robot overlords and how frightful it is. And the really super frightening thing is actually how socially insensitive and dumb our objects are, right? How everything seems to be beeping at once. It's screaming at us when we're in the middle of a family dinner and, not understanding, when, I actually got a text just now, but, devices are not working together, and they're not necessarily taking the information that is out there around context of use and putting that to good use to behave. So, everything's kind of misbehaving. And I think that's one of the worst case scenarios.
Okay, so everything is working on its own. It doesn't understand where we are in our lives. It doesn't understand all these other devices that may be shouting at us, which I totally get when my Roomba is like telling me, I've completed a job. And then Google's also like, your Roomba just or completed a job. And I'm like, stop, yo, I'm on the phone. So I see it. So let's kind of define what it means to be a social product as opposed to a smart product. So we can think about what are the elements. And I know you've got your framework, but break it down for us, like starting with, the very basics, like when we're physically designing the product, what are some of the things that we should be looking for?
Yeah. So, starting with the framework core is, I think, just really so important. And thinking about the form of an object and how it communicates, like even just something like an airport kiosk can be a thing that is, like, you're stressed, you're maybe running late if you're me, and you see this kiosk, and it is the presence you need to give you some reassurance. So I think that that's one important thing. I think, like you mentioned, the ecosystems and thinking about how all the products are working together, and in working together, how they are taking the information and not just giving us all the features, like, when John introduced the mission around smart design, it's not technology for technology's sake, which is what, as a seasoned product designer, I've seen so many years of just one-upmanship around. A great example is the Flip Minnow, which was a product that was designed by a team at Smart. And it was a moment in time when everyone had these kind of camcorders. They were like these sort of cylinder things that you held like this. And the one-upmanship was around resolution and I don't even remember the features. So many features that you frankly didn't get invested in. And then here came the Flip Minnow, which was this thing that could just sit in your pocket, that you could just pull out and turn it on and press a big red button, and you wouldn't miss your child's play because you were trying to set the resolution and everything else like that. So I think that is an aspect of just being a holistically, socially appropriate.
Okay. And I forgot to say this, but we're going to have Q&A at the end. I got so excited to talk to Carla about this. So you can start dropping it in the little Q&A box, or you can wait till closer to the end. Okay. So I feel like what you're talking about sounds amazing. And I like how you've oriented your framework. But I feel like if I'm designing a product, it seems impossible to think about an ecosystem right now because things don't talk to one another. So if I'm a designer, where should I start? Like, should I just ignore the ecosystem thing and try to think about how it can slide in and maybe think about updating over time? How do I do this in a real way?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are lots of very wicked, gnarly technical challenges at this particular moment in time. And we are still in what I would call the awkward teenage years. And this is something I think you talk about really eloquently on your podcast around some technical frameworks that need to exist. So first of all, I think designers who are working in this space should embrace their geek side. Number one, embrace the idea of thinking about networks, broadband, is there Wi-Fi access, what kind of Bluetooth is happening, and understand that right now we do have a series of protocols that are not necessarily aligned. And that's, so keeping abreast of that, first of all, which is sort of the larger wicked problem aspect of it. But what I really stress in the book is, as a designer, the bottom line is to maintain what you might call a North Star of the social appropriateness, and using that and those methods as a way to guide the design process, also as a way to keep a team aligned, so that everyone understands that they have the same goals, and that what they're working towards, what the engineering team is working towards, what the industrial design team is working towards, what a UX, UI team is working towards, is ultimately this social exchange between the person, the product, the people and the product, the people and the products. And that sounds like a simple thing, but it's actually very complex. And that's why I think it's really important to constantly check in as a team and understand what the social goals are. And one of the ways that I talk about in the book as well is doing some really great visioning exercises at the start of a project. And so one of the things I do, like what I did, of course, with the team at Diligent, as well as on other projects with clients, I'll actually work with, when we were working in person, we have other ways of doing it virtually now, but these initial workshops were always really important, of being there in person and talking about some of the key moments of interaction, some of the key scenarios. So in the case of Diligent, it would be the hospital hallway, passing people in the hallway, picking up samples, delivering a pickup, understanding what needs to be picked up for, etc. And what we do is we do body storming exercises. And so we're literally play acting what is involved in the situation, and we might have a piece of cardboard that represents a medication sample, and we might have a series of shelves that represents the pharmacist's area, and we have a person who represents the robot, and we act it out. Now you've handed it to the robot. What does the robot do? And that kind of highlights a lot of the nuances of the social interaction that might not come through when you're making a rendering or a drawing, or even an industrial design video that's spinning the product around, but not showing truly what's happening in the interaction between the person and the product.
I like that, because then you can actually see points where, like, a human might expect a point of contact or an acknowledgement from the robot, and where they might not. So, like, if I hand something to a robot, I probably want it to acknowledge receipt, maybe quickly. But once I turn away and it does something, I don't probably want to think about it anymore. So I like that. Um, let's talk about how that gets introduced into products. Actually, let's talk about how that can have an impact on things like privacy. So we've talked in the past and in the book about Amazon's Amazon Echo device, and how, you know, when you walk into a home, you don't necessarily know if it's listening, and kind of design decisions that could kind of convey that things are happening with the robots in our home that might be really beneficial for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another great example of why some of the visioning exercises become important. And even as ridiculous as they sound, a lot of what I talk about in the book are these metaphors where we think about the device as a human actor in a scene, right? And so if we think about an Amazon Echo, what's happening, so it does some things super brilliant, like the way that, for any of you who have experienced it, and I know there are many people, there's the light of, embedded within it is a series, 8 microphones at least, and the light will point and show who it's listening to. So that's a really nuanced and wonderful social interaction. What's not a social interaction is the fact that it's listening the moment you come in the room. So if we were to kind of play act our human actors, it's almost like walking into someone's home and having another person lurking in the corner and just kind of listening and not letting you know that he or she is there, and you think like, what is going on with that person, and until they suddenly pipe in to, and so I think that's the kind of moment that designers can be thinking about a little more. So what ways can we have more transparency and let a person know when they enter a room that there is a device that's listening to them?
So social design can help us with things like, obviously there's the user interface, which we're all excited about, but there's also things like privacy. Um, are there other elements where thinking this way gives either manufacturers or users, I want to say, a leg up, or kind of it helps them live with these devices?
Um, I mean, I think there are a number of ways. There's a lot to be learned from the field of social robotics, and you touched on it a little bit. Um, some of the nuances are, for example, thinking about attention. So having a device show you who it's paying attention to, and that again can be through, it can be, we're used to a lot of super verbose interactions, and one of the things I advocate for are abstract interactions. Like, so we could have a microphone, let's say, that's in a room, and it could actually swivel to point towards someone it's listening to, and then you know that it's paying attention to you. And in this world of social robotics, there is such a thing as gaze, so actually knowing that you're looking in someone's eye, and there is such a thing as shared attention, so that if there is an activity at hand, like let's say there's a spill in the hospital with our hospital robot, both the person and the robot could be looking at the same activity area, and that is another shared element, as well as many other things from social robotics: feedback, acknowledgement, acknowledgement of a task that's underway. Um, and, I think that thinking about those nuances of interaction and, how we can give those messages importance and communicate them. So another one of the things that I loved that was in the conference room at Smart Design was a Polycom camera that was just a cylinder, that that had what we would call 2 degrees of freedom in the world of robotics. It could pivot forward, and it could spin, and it would do this gesture when it was not listening or trained on anyone, when it was not trained on it, when it was not in the midst of a meeting. It would spin around and then tilt down, and it really felt like it was bowing its head and taking a nap and looking away. And so, just nuances of how we do those things, I think, can be really important to manufacturers.
I like that. And we're seeing this actually. I like the idea of layering those interactions for a couple reasons. So we're starting to see that, like, Amazon has their new Echo Show, and I'm sorry to keep using Amazon as an example. I'll come up with some other ones, but they're adding
They're leading in a lot of ways. And
they're adding motion to a display. So now I have voice, it will talk to me. It can also on the display indicate something, and now they've got motion happening. And that seems really neat. Uh, but it also seems like if you're building something for that platform, it seems really complicated when you have all of these choices. So how do you decide which social elements to use as a designer? What is there, like a flow chart to use, or
no, there's lots of flow charts. There's actually lots of flow charts.
I know designers love their flow charts.
Yes. You know, what is really critical is identifying the key moments of interaction, and then breaking those down. And so one of the things, one of the projects that I worked on with Smart many years ago that I actually wrote about in an op-ed for the New York Times was Nito Robotics, which was a startup at the time. And what I did when leading the interaction efforts was work with the company to identify what some key moments are. And there were a lot of really complex aspects of the project, such as being able to train the robot to clean just a room as opposed to the whole house. And so there were a lot of methods around breaking down the types of interactions. So, and thinking about it with these human metaphors, like there are moments of distress. So if the robot is running out of battery and can't get to its base, that's a moment, if it's running out of battery, that's a moment of distress. If it's running out and it's not going to be able to reach its base, that's, extreme distress when it needs the help of a person. And then there are these celebratory moments as well. Like you talked about, the Roomba saying that it's done its job. And, we worked on some of those moments as well as a larger timeline of the whole relationship of like, that was fun when I first got you, but maybe not so fun a couple of years in when it's happening over and over again.
Please stop singing now.
Yeah. But what happens in that whole process of identifying those moments can then be fed into a flow chart, right? And this moment happens with these circumstances, yes or no, like this. But the bigger picture and the most important part to the designer is translating. And, a lot of this process is about translating what's happening in what I might call the robot brain or the machine brain into human ease. So, in that project, for example, I literally had us do a script of what the robot is saying. So it's, saying, help me, I'm stuck under the couch, or hey, I need you to just give me a little piece of information around programming, or hey, I just finished the room, I'm moving on to the other room. And those become this script, and then that script gets translated again I love thinking about it in terms of these distilled modalities of light, sound, and movement, and thinking about, and then there are decisions around which of those to use based on what's most appropriate, right? Like the robot vacuum cleaner is a great example because it's something that we don't necessarily interact with in front of our faces like a kiosk or a phone, but we might actually interact with it. We might actually be in the other room. So some things are appropriate as a sound. Some things are appropriate as a movement. I worked with the engineers in the company because it was using a new kind of navigation system that could actually identify objects, kind of a LiDAR. And I said, can it recognize a person in front of it? And so, we were able to build in this little kind of like, oh, hello, and you're in my way, bye. Really just a subtle, quick tone, but, thinking about what's appropriate in all of those circumstances. And that's the case when it could actually do a little movement as well. Like it actually can say, well, it can back up and then go back on its job.
And I think mapping those things out becomes really important when we start thinking about, like, right now you might have to write a script and program it, like developers of the product might have to program it itself. But when we start going out to like bringing in context from other places, or we think about things like machine learning on the device itself is going to have to figure that out on its own. And so the designer has to start thinking of that and kind of consider all those options very early on. Which is crazy. That wasn't. There's not really a question there, but if you want to expand on that, you can, or I can go on to the next question.
Yeah, no.
Next question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Point.
So, cultural, like if I'm designing a product for around the world, in some places, a swipe may mean something. We have a pretty limited vocabulary that's universal for certain things like swiping right and left. And if you were listening to this, you can't even see me swiping. But when we start designing products for global use, what are social customs are different. So how do you kind of think about that when you're building these products?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and a really challenging one, but it's a good thing that you bring it up because it is something to be sensitive to and to think about. I mean, particularly, um, let's think about things like color and, red, for example, we think of as bad, danger, caution, but in many other cultures, it's a color of celebration. And so I think that that's where some of the more complex aspects of the ways that we can work, and this is a lot of the point of the book, is that we're at a moment where we have a ton of technology, where we can do so much, and that it's no longer so much about how do we do these very complex behaviors, but why do we do them? And so thinking about programming or having a device that uses something like AI or uses machine learning to learn gestures or to learn something about the local environment that it's in and then respond appropriately starts to become where design becomes really interesting and where it becomes really like creating a robot as opposed to this kind of like baked in scripted thing.
That's an awesome idea. I like it. And it makes being a designer so much more both challenging and interesting. Uh, with your modalities that you talked about, light, motion, sound, I would love for you to talk about how we can bring accessibility to these products using social design because or when you're making these decisions how you can kind of maybe broaden the use for some devices to people who may not have been able to use it before.
Oh, yeah. I think there's a lot of potential for that. Recently with the with my group of students here at Cranbrook, I had brought in a great researcher whose name is Timioya Deji, who he was working with an R&D lab that was working with IKEA. They're called Space 10. He's now a researcher with Google. And he has been working particularly around gesture and machine learning. And, because of the book, I was recently asked to comment on like, why gesture? And there, suddenly I thought of uh, a ton of reasons. So, one of them becomes um, ease of use. Well, certainly there are a lot of things that emerge from our pandemic that are around keeping surfaces clean, so not touching things. But beyond that, when we think about, let's say, any device that's in the kitchen, and you might have your hands completely mucky with whatever you're cooking. And so being able to gesture at a device or even speak to a device is something that can help you. And again, it's all contextually relevant. And then, from there, we can think about how that also expands to a larger audience. So, one of the principles that the founders of smart design were working on was universal design, which was looking at how we might design something that is better for some of edges of our population, but then how do things that benefit give us greater accessibility for parts of the population actually give everyone a better, more delightful product to use. And so I think that a lot of the things that I talk about around social design, around using gesture, around having, say, light behaviors, can help accessibility. And I know this is something also you and I have maybe talked a little bit about in one of our conversations on your podcast, things like using that. So one of the things I know you and I both do, and that designers should do as well, is to look at how people are hacking things, right? So one of the systems that a lot of people use is the if this then that tool, which allows you to create what they call a recipe, so that anyone can program something to say, oh, if I get a call from my cousin Sylvia, have the lights flash in the room, right? And that becomes something that's kind of like a nerdy experiment, but then it also can be really great for someone who's hearing impaired, for example. So I think that what we're talking about with these product behaviors that are ambient, that are there's some researchers have used this word calm technology, that allow for a holistic experience that doesn't have us digging into a screen with small type where we have to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I would say I would encourage people who are thinking this way to look at, the hard of hearing, the blind community, and also to parents, because I think one of the more awesome things about having not necessarily smart devices, but connected devices is being able to communicate, or actually letting my kids, when they were, I only have one, letting my child or just kids in general communicate with devices before they can read or before they can, have a smartphone or an app. So, my daughter she now vacuums her own room because she can just, ask, our vacuum is named Terrence, ask Terrence to vacuum her room. And you think about, like, you talked about your child and setting up when he was younger, nano leaf lights to indicate time of day. There's a lot of opportunity here to see how people are using this really creatively. I don't know if you want to add on to that or talk about, how, I guess, well, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm going to interrupt because there's a lot there. And Tom and I talk about kids a lot on the RoboPsych podcast, because there's so many nuances to this idea that now our products are robots, right? Because there are a lot of implications. So, you could think about there's a woman named Kate Darling who's been doing a research around how the ways that we relate to our products then can have implications around how we relate to each other or how we behave as human beings. So yeah, I have a lot of things that I notice about my little boy and the way that we interact with the products and the things that I bring home that I'm really interested in. And one of the things that I insist on doing is using please when we talk to our Amazon Echo. Could you set a timer for 30 seconds, please? I do that. I actually do that at home because I feel like it is modeling a social behavior.
I agree. I always say thank you, and sometimes they respond. And sometimes we have talked about this. I yell at my devices when they don't behave as intended. So we should probably talk about, like, the panic or, oh my gosh, I've screwed up as a designer, and, like, in explaining that, or like having a feedback loop, because I know that when my Echo starts, like, advertising things after I've asked it the weather, and it's like, oh, by the way, would you like to, you know, purchase a, I don't know. And it does this. I'm not kidding. So,
No, I know we talked about it. It said,
so
would you like
yeah.
me to create a gift list? I said, please do not do that again, Alexa.
But should there be some sort of, I guess, negative feedback loop that's prioritized as part of this process of designing these robots?
Yeah,
Maybe not negative,
absolutely.
just a feedback loop.
Right. Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's part of, again, where the intelligence comes in, and the intelligence is, it's around language, but it's also around emotion and understanding emotion, or understanding that I was really upset too when when the Echo started pushing product on me and in the middle of me asking for the time or the weather or something like that. And there's a series of companies that have been started around affective computing, so understanding emotion, understanding how to read our facial expressions, understanding our tone of voice, as well as breaking down language and thinking about how to respond. And there's an enormous and interesting and complex nuances around that as well. I mean, one of the folks I interview in the book is Jonathan Foster, who comes from a screenwriting background and led the team that was developing Cortana, and led the content team. And he talked a lot about how there's a team of writers that had to think about how to respond in certain situations, or things that, like, people might actually confide things in the device that they might not be confiding to a human being. And or the abuse, like how does Cortana respond? Like there's certain phrases like, okay, moving on, she'll say, and like things like that. So there's a lot to be worked on, and it goes beyond designers too, which is another thing that I think was really exciting about writing this book and about doing the podcast, is thinking about the importance of all of the humanities in this, and thinking about writers and psychologists and anthropologists, and how important those insights are to the nuances of a product behavior.
So what are the big things standing in the way of this? We've kind of touched on some, like the lack of standards, like if we want to have it to function in an ecosystem, uh, maybe we need more diverse teams. So what are the things that are standing in the way from us building these products?
Well, I certainly think there's a lot around the way that businesses are organized, and having there's just traditionally been a lot of silos in business, where you have design here, and you have engineering here, and you have marketing here, and having those folks have a common goal and a common language, and that is a much easier. I've been on some consulting projects with some of the firms I've worked for, where that's a enormous, and having a company redesign their culture is a project that goes way beyond an individual designer, for sure, or even the design team. So that's one. And then, certainly a lot of the standards, and the fact that we are still in this place where things work okay, but our Wi-Fi doesn't always connect, and the Bluetooth doesn't always figure out which device it wants to be connected to. And so there's a lot of challenges around understanding that the limitations, and all of the limitations in different contexts, right? Like as soon as I walk out of my door, I get disconnected from this Wi-Fi network and go to another one. So what's the response there? But then, ultimately, and one of the things that I get to at the end of the book are some of the ethical considerations as well around the what I think designers definitely need to be thinking about. And some of that is around persuasion. So now that we're talking about devices that can read our emotions, that can respond, that we start to respond to socially, there is the potential for us to be persuaded. And
Yeah, social robots could be manipulative robots.
Yeah, yeah. And it's essentially social engineering, right? And so being aware of what the goals of the product are, and feeling aligned with the ethics of that, and is it leading me to bad habits or bad behaviors, and what is it leading me to purchase things I don't want to, And then another aspect of the ethics is then around, the vulnerability. So, just the vulnerability from any of us being persuaded, but then there are certainly a lot of products that are coming into the hands of vulnerable populations, like kids, which you talked about, as well as folks with cognitive disabilities. And so, being hyper aware, I think, of the risks and dangers around a vulnerable population is really important. And then, of course, we get to privacy considerations. And, one of the things, I wrote a piece for Fast Company around ubiquitous cameras and how they're exposing things that we don't want them to necessarily expose. And in that piece, it was really this difficulty as a designer between having the benefit. There's so much technologically that we can do with camera vision. We can read a person's heart rate just by looking at their face. We can read if a bridge is vibrating. There's a thing at the MIT CSAIL school around that's called Eulerian magnification. But we can basically have a video feed that you and I as human beings see nothing in, but the robot brain can detect a whole host of things. And so it's very exciting as a designer, because then we have this super powerful, what I call the everything sensor. But then, of course, what does that mean then? Like, I worked with a client in a hotel setting, and we had some really strict limitations around what products could have this everything sensor in them. And so, balancing the benefits with the risks, not to mention the ability to be hacked and to fall into the hands of nefarious individuals.
Yeah, and then communicating that potential to people, it's a lot. So in a second, we're going to answer some questions. We've already got some, so please
Cool.
feel free to add more. But I would love to know, and this ties into actually one of the questions that was asked. Their question is, how far in the future will it be before we're interacting with these social robots? But I would even just say, how do we know we're there at a point where social robots we've decided that we're going to embrace this philosophy of design? So how far and how do we know if we're there?
Yeah. Well, I think that I think it's already happening. And some of certainly what I work on with Diligent Robotics, although that is not a product for in-home use. It's a highly specialized product, very expensive, sophisticated product for the hospital setting. But we are already starting to see the things like security robots, and we use this word robot, but there are a lot of things. There's a way in which we can call your Amazon show a robot. It moves.
I think it's a robot.
Yeah. So I do think that we are there. The question is, are we there well? Are those robots showing up well, or are they failing us? And I think that the litmus test of whether or not we're there is another principle that I really espouse a lot, particularly here at Cranbrook in the 4D department, is that the bottom line is that we should not be thinking about the technology. Like, the technology should be getting out of the way. There might be enormous technology and enormous challenge for us as designers to consider how we're using these complex tools, but to the person who is experiencing it, it should feel like it is just not in the way.
I look forward to that day. Even today, I have a hard time instructing my many devices to do things, even though it's supposed to be pretty intuitive. I'm like, it's okay. I'll work on it. It's also because I name them complicated things, because my daughter, she's like, let's call that lamp Finley. I'm like, let's call it something a little more helpful. All right. So speaking of my daughter, what kind of generational differences are you seeing regarding how people think about privacy? It's not really my daughter, but she's young.
Generational differences regarding privacy. Tom, that's a good one. I think that, well, certainly and Tom and I have talked about this a little bit as well. Um, we're getting, younger populations are just more accustomed to giving away information or to not thinking as much about privacy, but when given the benefit, like we all read those, enormous, well, none of us read those enormous legalese screens that tell us, what exactly we're giving away, because we go, yeah, but I'm going to be able to, talk to grandma right now. Like, let's do that. So I think that I've certainly seen younger populations, or it may be that there's a pendulum that swings one way and the other, but who are much more willing to, and there's an entire population that's grown up with cameras in every on every street corner, where they know that they've been recorded, whereas that's not something that in my generation, for example, is an idea that is at all comfortable or that I'm used to. But I also think one of the things that you wrote about in one of your newsletters, Stacey, was around educating kids into how all of this works. And that was also one of the goals of the book, is that it's really not just for designers, but kind of for everyone to have a better understanding of how these devices are working, so that we can make informed choices and, maybe be asking for more transparency, or maybe, understanding the difference between this is a device that's using camera vision as opposed to this is the device that's reading my gesture via radar and doesn't have that's getting pretty geeky into it. But I think that education for the general population is a worthwhile goal.
Sure, I would agree. And I also think we'll have to have some regulations around this, simply because I don't think it's possible for any human to understand the implications of not just computer vision, like what it can tell, but also the fact that a computer can store it and render it searchable for the rest of your life, the most insignificant things. That's A kid may know they're being on camera, but they don't really understand that yet. Um, so this is a very practical question. I like it. This is from Anonymous. Do you think that traditional design processes, like the ones they learn at university, should change and evolve more to incorporate what you're presenting? And how should that look?
Yes. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that a lot of traditional design processes involve a representation of the design in a static form. And I think that's the key aspect that changes, is that we need to be thinking about how things move, how things sound, how lights are changing, how things are, actually things are animated, right? And we should be thinking about how we depict that animation. And that's a lot of part of I keep talking about my 4D program because I love it, but it's the fourth dimension. But a lot of people say, what the heck is 4D? And it's the fourth dimension is time, and it is how things change over time, all of these dynamic characteristics around light, sound, and motion. And so I think that's something that can be taught at the foundation level in the university, to understand that if I show your this microphone that shifts, like it takes on a different form when it's turned one way as opposed to another, and we're not totally appreciating how important that gesture is in the core identity of the product.
I would also, I'm not sure if I'm adding on to this or just you've already kind of said this, but it's not just dynamic within the number of like the types of interactions, but it's also time in the sense that with connected devices, you can update them with software. And over time, the relationship will change because of new features that you add or how those relate to other features. And I think that's a very new element of design. And companies who get it right will make you love their product. And I'll give an example. My Roomba, Terrence, recently I got a suggestion that said, "Hey, Terrence has noticed that you could clean underneath your kitchen counters." It identified the section in your home. I don't know if it identified it because it was constantly dirty. I don't know if it identified it because it was just in the kitchen, but it popped up and it was like, "Hey, do you want to set this as like a cleaning parameter?" It was amazing to me that someone thought through this interaction and said, once I've been in someone's home for a while, I can figure out what's dirty and suggest ways to keep it cleaner easily. And those are the kind of things I don't think people are thinking about right now really much at all.
Yeah, and I think that's where the context ring of the framework comes in, right? Thinking about and where and when do you get that advice, and is it appropriate or not, and the fact that it is a cleaning device and is taking in information, and it's not just information for information's sake, right? It's not giving you a chart of all the spills that or the crumbs that it's picked up. Although that would be interesting.
Today I have cleaned up 400 messages or 400 messes.
400 messes. Yeah.
Okay. This is a good one that is everyone's talking about it. So other than facial recognition, what have you seen bias infiltrate social robot design?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's certainly facial recognition, and there's a researcher at Stanford whose name is Michal Kosinski, and he did this fascinating study around uh, reading. He did one around um, reading faces and sexual orientation, and he also he and his team studied things like Facebook likes. You might go on Facebook and think, oh, I don't ever post anything. I just kind of like things. And there's a pretty lowish, relatively low threshold around understanding someone, being able to predict someone's responses as well as a coworker, as well as a spouse. But I'm off on a tangent with that. The question was around these really ethical issues that have been coming up around bias, and I know there's been a lot around the bias that goes into a device because of the people who are programming it, and I think that there's facial recognition. There's also the use of language. I think that
Yeah, there's bias. I would say bias against children. Like, and if you look at natural language processing, there's bias against certain accents. People are working on it. But I can think of several devices. Like I have sensors in my car, not my car seat, but just the seat of the car. And my kid for a while was too small to register as being in that seat, which meant like an airbag wouldn't deploy. Um, so I'm just answering part of these questions, but if you have other bias examples, I'm happy to stop talking.
Yeah, I think right, language and yeah, certainly body type for sure comes into it a lot.
Okay.
With all design. I think that goes for kind of all aspects of design. There are many tools that are designed for a man's hands, for example.
True. Okay, let's see. Oh, I don't, you want to talk about the 3 laws of robotics? There's a question about how social robots can become as helpful as the robots from the movie I, Robot, or what they were supposed to be, minus them, murdering people and that sort of thing.
That, right. Well, there's a lot there as well in terms of the 3 laws of robotics. And there's starting to be a burgeoning field around robotics and ethics. And I think that the robot can't harm a person is so such a great goal, and it's also really complicated. If you let's think about something like the autonomous vehicle, and there's a classic ethical dilemma that is discussed in robotics. It's called the trolley problem that many of our listeners would be familiar with, and there are lots of variations of it, but I'll just come up with one. It's if there's a trolley and it's got a load of people, and there's a child in the road, and then in the tracks, let's say, and switching to another track will save the child but kill all the people on the trolley. What do you do now? That that's the core of it, but then you say, well, let's say it's not a lever, but it's just a button to press. And then let's say it's not a button to press. Now it's a set of instructions, right? And then it goes from not just being a theoretical exercise to being an exercise that is actually being implemented today in autonomous vehicles, where there do have to be decisions that are programmed into, well, what happens in this circumstance as opposed to this circumstance, and who is the bias towards saving the passengers in the car, is the bias towards saving the folks outside, and who decides that, and how is it decided, and it's a decision that gets programmed into what I like to call the robot brain.
And it also makes riding in autonomous vehicles so frustrating. These are the slowest moving, longest thinking cars. Every AV demo is just excruciating. So it has, that kind of consideration should not be in quotes. That has an impact on the ultimate user experience, which, we can argue about that. All right. Well, I feel like, Carla, we have talked about so many fun things. We didn't talk about naming our robots or whether or not we need apps, but you'll just have to read the book to find out some of this stuff. And now we should bring it back to our lovely host, John, to conclude.
Thank you so much. I actually wanted to give like one little anecdote coming from the programming aspects of especially the bias question. I think considering we've been doing a lot of machine learning recently, when you start to build out like the models to try to make products more personalized, what you do is you try to create like catch-alls so that when people ask a question or it's a face or whatever those things are, they get grouped into things, and that's actually where things become generalized and then become biased. And so oftentimes when you see articles around like bias around machine learning or AI, that's typically how those things are. And so as designers and as programmers, we have to come up with an ability to develop nuances within those generalizations. And that's how we might try to alleviate some of those issues. And I know that people are working on it right now, because if you don't have those nuances, then you get into like precarious positions. So I just like, when I heard that question, I was like, ooh, I would love to like talk about that one. But thank you all for coming today. And if you want to revisit the discussion or share it with others, we're going to be posting the recording on our website along with the summary in about a week. And so one last time, if you haven't gotten your copy of Carla's new book, My Robot Gets Me, Don't forget, we have a special 40% off courtesy of the Harvard Business Review Press. And we're going to be posting the link in the chat along with the code to get that 40% off. And then looking at a few things ahead, for our next salon, Smart Design is co-sponsoring the NYC Design Fair's Product Day with the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which just so happens to be the new home of Smart. And so join us on Monday, May 17th at 5 p.m. Eastern for what promises to be a fantastic conversation about creativity, collaboration, and community. You can sign up at the link below at go.smartdesignworldwide.com/productday21. And we'll post it in the chat. And thanks again, Carla and Stacey, for joining us and kind of giving us some of your framework and your new book. It was extremely fascinating, and I recommend everyone to read the book because it's great.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone.